Hi, I'm Eric Ziolkowski of the Religious Studies Department in Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, where I'm professor and head. I want to welcome you to this Easton Book Festival event. And first, I want to start by thanking Andy Lattice, who's the director and conceiver of the whole festival. It's a wonderful gift to the city of Easton. We've had this now for several years, and it's a wonderful asset to the city. And Lafayette College this year is the sponsor of the festival. I also want to thank the 4 panelists who all agreed to join this panel on rather short notice because the book that it's about only appeared a short while ago. Kayley got a little head start because, as you'll find out, she was involved in the production, Kayley Hoffman. But the rest of us, it's a 600+ page book, and we've read it in a relatively short time, and it's well worth the read. And I also want to thank everyone for attending, those of you in the live audience. So the book is David Maraniss's Path Lit by Lightning, which the life of Jim Thorpe, which appeared, as I mentioned, it was published by Simon Schuster, and it appeared just a few months ago. Many are familiar with Maraniss's other biographies: Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Roberto Clemente, the great baseball player, and also Vince Lombardi. He's done biographies of all of them, but this one is the most recent. And why a 600-page biography of Jim Thorpe at this time? I mean, that's one of the questions we'd like to consider. But as you know, the title, Path Lit by Lightning, it's an English rendering of Jim Thorpe's name, Watho Hook, in the language of his native people, the Sac and Fox people, now located in Oklahoma. And before proceeding, it might be worthwhile just reminding us who Jim Thorpe was and what he accomplished. And this will be very brief, but I want to quote just a statement from Maraniss's book. Born in 1887 in the Indian Territory of what later became Oklahoma, Thorpe was the quintessential underdog who rose from nowhere to become the greatest athlete in the world, the natural who could do anything on the fields of play. He was an Olympic champion decathlete in track and field in both the pentathlon and the decathlon. That's a total of 15 events over the course of about 4 or 5 days. He was a football All-American at a time when some people defined football as a death sentence playing it. It was so violent and so many people got seriously injured and died from it. He was a star pro and first president of what became the National Football League. And he was also a Major League Baseball player, a seemingly indestructible force who, and this is still Maraniss's words, who ran like a wild horse thundering downhill, yet was also a graceful ballroom dancer and a gifted swimmer and ice skater. So there are several connections between Thorpe, actually, in the city of Easton and Lafayette College in particular. He played Lafayette in football once. He was a halfback. He came to Easton, and actually he got injured seriously in the leg and ankle, and it left him on crutches. But great athlete and recoverer that he was on the field the next week against Penn. He also came and competed against the Lafayette track and field team. And this is rather remarkable. He had his greatest day as a track and field athlete. He and a Hopi teammate who later went with him to the Olympics, actually. He was a distance runner. The two of them alone together totaled more points than the entire Lafayette track team in that competition. He won 6 events in that one track meet. He took first place in the 120-yard hurdles, 220-yard low hurdles, long jump, which was one of his specialties, the high jump, shot put, and discus. He won all 6 events against the whole team, which, so there's single athletes from Lafayette competing in each of those events. Much later, a very different sort of connection with Lafayette actually concerns William E. Simon, who's 19 52 alumnus of the college, one of the most famous alumni. He was also a one-time trustee of the college. Simon, as some of you may remember or know, was U.S. Treasury Secretary under Nixon, but later he was chairman of the United States Olympic Committee. And Simon played a crucial role in persuading the International Olympic Committee to restore Thorpe's medals posthumously that had been stripped from him. As you know, one of the most tragic events of his life was his medals were taken from him because he, like many amateur athletes at the time, he had played a couple of seasons of semi-pro baseball, and on those grounds, they took his medals away because of his amateur status was compromised. But in any case, later the medals were restored to his children, but that was all long after he died. So without further ado, though, I do want to embark on our panel. We have 4 panelists, and we're going to be considering Thorpe, his life, and the book from very different perspectives. And I've asked each person to speak for about up to 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. The first panelist is Kayley Hoffman, who was born and raised in Jim Thorpe, PA, the town named after Jim Thorpe. And she'll comment on that background and also her relationship to Maraniss's new biography, because she's not only on the panel because she grew up in Jim Thorpe, but perhaps most importantly, she was involved in the production as an editor at Simon & Schuster. So she was involved in the production of this book. She's the senior production editor at the press. In her career, she's worked across all genres of books for people, all ages and genres of books for people. Her favorite genres are literary fiction, memoir, young adult literature, and graphic novels. In addition to the Maraniss, some of her legacy authors include Hillary Clinton, Nelson DeMille, Jessica Null, Sam Lipsyte, Mona Awad, Paul Yoon, and Catherine McKenzie. She has worked on recent bestsellers, including I'm Glad My Mom Died, The Final Revival of Opal and Nev, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, and a bunch of others. In her own words, with the publication of Path Lit by Lightning, about the man for whom her hometown was named, Kayley Hoffman truly feels that her life and career have come full circle. Today, she and her family reside in Easton. So please welcome Kayley Hoffman.
So as Eric said, I was born and raised in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, and I left at 18 to go to college in New York City, which is how I then got into publishing. But wanted to talk about growing up in the town and what it's like. It's changed drastically since the time I grew up there. And I would say for people who are familiar with it, if anyone has been here, has been to the town, it's because you've probably gone to the Fall Foliage Festival, which is happening now. They have tons of festivals there. People go antiquing there. But I would say the majority of tourists don't go there to see Jim Thorpe. Definitely not now. People, go hiking, biking, but so Jim Thorpe, his memorial is actually on the other side of town where most of the activity takes place, sort of tucked away. And I think that as we talk more about it and talk about this on the panel today, it actually will tie into everything in the way that his erasure to some extent is happening in that town and throughout his life. So just a little bit of history of the town. I don't want to give anything away to the book, so hopefully this isn't a spoiler alert for the end of the town or for the end of the book, but to talk about a little bit of how Jim Thorpe came to be in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. So what had happened was when he died in 1953, his third wife, Patsy, was looking to have a grand memorial for him to honor him in her mind. And it was sort of divisive in his family, where his family was divided, his kids were divided, thinking, oh, she just wants money. And some of his kids thought, no, she wants to memorialize our father. And so in doing this, she was, I guess, for lack of a better term, shopping his body around to different places. And the way that she had heard about what is now Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, formerly Mauch-Chunk and East Mauch-Chunk, she had heard, she was in Philadelphia and had saw a television program, and David also talks about this in the book, talking about the struggles in these two poor coal towns in the Poconos. And so after watching the program and visiting, she really fell in love with the area and then proceeded to make a deal to get Jim Thorpe buried there. And so there is a man who had run the newspaper that is still published in Lafayette, Pennsylvania, which is adjacent to Jim Thorpe. His name is Joe Boyle. And at the time he was trying to get around the turn, well, at the turn of the century, the town had been an extremely popular tourist town as it is now. They had the Switchback Railroad, which at the time was the second largest tourist attraction in the United States after Niagara Falls. It's considered to be one of the world's first roller coasters. If you visited Jim Thorpe, you'll see one of the mountains there, Mount Pisgah, has a very long slope on it, the Pisgah Plain. This is where rail carts had gone up and down at the turn of the century. And so at that point, people were allowed to take rail rides up and down the coal carts. And so it was a big thrill, a big attraction. But as times changed, the Depression hit, the town, as many of the other towns in the area, just sort of fell into a bit of a slump. And in order to revitalize tourism in the town, Joe Boyle started this nickel-a-week program with hopes of building the town and building an industrial complex to just bring more life to the town. So when Patsy was trying to get Thorpe's body somewhere where people would actually, visit him, remember him, memorialize him, she found this fortuitous relationship with Joe Boyle. And so the stipulation was that the town would get his body, rename the town Jim Thorpe PA, because at the time they were two towns merging. And so the town at the time paid, I think, about $1,000 to $1,500 to Patsy for his body. And some of Patsy's promises, which never came to fruition in the town, was to have a Pro Football Hall of Fame museum there, have a big cancer hospital. These things never ended up happening. If you've been to the town, and as I've grown up there, definitely not the case. So that is just a little bit of context. And if you've been reading the news in recent years, you would know that his children have tried to get, and grandchildren tried to get his body back to Oklahoma to be properly buried. But it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decision in 2015 declined the appeal. And so now Jim Thorpe's remains are still resting in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, a town that he had never set foot in his life. So with that context in mind, I just wanted to talk about my experience growing up in Jim Thorpe and sort of the myth of who he was in the context of my education. So I'd say that, like, as I mentioned, the majority of tourists really don't know who Jim Thorpe was, but I would say that the majority of people who I grew up with, at least, don't know the full extent of his story with his remains. Meaning that the narrative was, Joe Boyle and Jim Thorpe saved our town by having his remains here. We revitalized our town. We were able to memorialize this great man, without thinking about the larger context of like what it means for his body and spirit to be displaced, when his family was trying to have a burial ceremony for him in Oklahoma, and that's where he would have been properly buried. And I feel my opinion is maybe the minority in the town, and it's not anything that I would say is malicious, but people generally there love Jim Thorpe and love the man, and maybe don't have the larger idea of knowing some of these details and what that means, because I didn't. And my education, I think, was sort of what I learned was just passed down about him as this great athlete without knowing anything more. And I never really questioned it until I was in my 20s and had heard about the Supreme Court, like his family trying to appeal to get his body back to Oklahoma, and really made me question just everything that I'd learned. But growing up, talked about the way the town does love Jim Thorpe. My high school sports teams, we were all the Jim Thorpe Olympians. My tennis team, Jim Thorpe Olympians, football team. The school is located on One Olympian Way. We even briefly had a mascot. I don't think this is still the case, called Torchy, for the Olympic torch. And there is a Jim Thorpe birthday festival every year in the town, which I think has only grown exponentially from when I was a kid. And I do remember when I was in school, Jim Thorpe was on the Wheaties box. And when that happened, it was basically a holiday. I was in the marching band played. We have parades constantly for XYZ reason for Jim Thorpe. So definitely beloved in the town, but as far reaching as people coming to the town, I think to see Jim Thorpe is a little bit lost. And David Maraniss really, and we might touch upon this later, brings this apart, like at the end of the book of a story of Muhammad Ali visiting Jim Thorpe's grave. And just saying, like, I'm here to pay my respects, and the people in the town just saying, like, oh, well, you know, we paid all this money and all we got was a dead Indian. And so that is sort of the way that the idea is of, if you don't really know, you don't know. So I guess to sort of sum it up, and I want to move quickly, I know, because also I want everybody else to be able to speak, to go into why I think that this book is being published now. There's some information I have, like, from David about why this book is published now, and my own opinions, but I think a book like David's being published is a snapshot of one famous Native American when there are countless other stories of lesser known natives who face similar horrors, as Jim Thorpe did growing up and what ended up happening to him. I feel hopeful that this awareness will bring some semblance of justice to his family with this book's publication. And what I know from having my conversations with David as we worked on this book, that he embarked on writing this, it was, I think he said 20 years ago. Again, don't want to speak for him, but just remembering our conversations, when somebody came up to him at a panel for another one of his books and had said, here you go, here's some information, here's your next book, it's a biography of Jim Thorpe. And David has said, I don't really take advice from people. I you know, thank you for telling me this, but you know, I write about what I'm passionate about at the time. But the seed of the idea was sort of planted in his head. And then he revisited it as he was writing his sports trilogy. And he said this was Vince Lombardi, Roberto Clemente, and then Jim Thorpe. And these biographies he was writing not just to be sports biographies, but to also examine sociologically where these people fell at certain points in history. And Jim Thorpe seemed like a perfect end cap for that. And I think the timing of this biography is also part of a long overdue and still very minor shift in the publishing industry, to publish works written by and or about people of color. Publishing, I've now been in the industry for 11 years, and before that interning in college. And so I've been adjacent to the industry for a long time. And it is still very rife with gatekeeping, and it really suffers from its own internal diversity issues. So as I feel like the industry moves slowly to make some progress, stories about figures like Thorpe are very timely. And also culturally, like what's happening right now, as more stories of, you know, the horrors of what have happened to Native Americans are in the news, the Dakota Access Pipeline, what's happening to the violence of Native American women. I feel like the country is finally addressing some Native issues and bringing these stories and struggles to light. And so I feel with the background of sports, David has really definitely told a larger story of the white man's erasure and manipulation of Native Americans. And I think Thorpe's abilities were unique, but the treatment of a Native American in this country was not. And I really hope, if you haven't read the book, that you get a chance to, because it tells a really incredible story of a man who went through these systems as many other Native Americans did in this country, and his life trajectory rising and falling, and what happened with his body, I think, is sort of an end cap of really where we are as a country as far as our treatment of Native Americans. So I feel like that's a lot. I would love to have other people speak, but that's my story, and would love to talk to you about it more if you want to know more about the town.
Thanks so much, Taylor. And in fact, if you have any questions for Taylor or any of the other panelists, please do. I'm trying to get this echo stuff. Please do. Save them for after all four panelists have spoken and we'll have time. So our second panelist is Daniel M. Cobb, who's been
professor of in the Department of American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, since 2010. Previously, he taught in the history department of Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, which is also where our fourth panelist taught, and was assistant director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. From 2017 to 2018, he served as Fulbright Bicentennial Chair in American Studies at the University of Helsinki, Finland. His research and teaching focuses on American Indian history since 1887, which birth year of Jim Thorpe, political activism, ethno-historical methods, ethnobiography, memory, and global indigenous rights. His first book, Native Activism in Cold War America, The Struggle for Sovereignty, published in 2008, won an inaugural Lambriola Center American Indian National Book Award. He's co-editor of Beyond Red Power, American Indian Politics and Activism since 1900, which was published in 2007, and also editor of Memory Matters in 2011. Other books of his include an edition of William T. Higgins' classic work, American Indians, and also Say We Are Nations, Documents in Politics and Protests in Indigenous America since 1887. His current research and writing projects continue to explore American Indian political activism broadly conceived. He's now completing a monograph that focuses on the life of Ponca activist Clyde Warrior, a central figure in American Indian youth movement of the 1960s, and an innovative biography of Flathead writer and intellectual Darcy McNichol. So we're very happy to have Daniel Cobb with us. Please welcome Daniel.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you, Kayley, for a great introduction to the to this discussion and this panel, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, Bob and Sandy. I'm going to try to share my screen with you. There we are. Can everybody see it? Yeah, I can see that you can see it. It's behind Kayley. I am also going to start a timer to keep myself honest. So, like I said, it's a real pleasure to be here. And what I wanted to do today is give you a perspective on this biography from the field of American Indian and Indigenous Studies, and sort of locate the way in which Thorpe is written about in this larger intellectual and interpretive context. And I'll just going to kind of speak broadly about this. I think that Thorpe deserves all of the works that have been produced in and around his life, because he really was among, if not the greatest athlete of all time, as something we had talked about in a smaller group preparing for this meeting. But what I wanted to key in on, actually, is a point that Kayley raised as well, is that his life was not anomalous in that way. And in fact, he lives an unexpected life relative to the settler colonial society and the way it was thinking about indigenous people at that time, but it wasn't an anomalous one. And to make this point, I'm drawing a bit from Philip Deloria, one of the most important folks working in American Indian Studies these days, in his phenomenal book, Indians in Unexpected Places. And Deloria talks about this concept of expectation, as you can see here, in terms of colonial imperial relations of power and domination that exist, in this case, between American Indian people and the United States. In other words, relationships that are empowered produce expectations that people have, of one another. And he says then you might see an expectation, the ways in which popular culture works to produce and sometimes to compromise racism and misogyny, and of course, a host of other things. And the world in which Jim Thorpe grew up was a fundamentally racially antagonistic one toward indigenous people. And to live a life against that grain makes for a profound life worthy of our attention, but it doesn't make it an anomalous one. And this is the point that Deloria makes last. He says he'd like us to distinguish between the anomalous, which reinforces expectations, right? So if he's different than what we think and we define that as wholly different, then it actually reinforces what we thought in the first place, is that Native people don't belong at the Olympics. Native people don't belong in professional sports. Native people don't belong in the movies, right? Whereas if we think about Thorpe's life as being an unexpected one, well, then that causes us to resist the very categorizations that led to the expectations themselves. And that, to me, is what's important about Thorpe's life, but the lives of other people of his generation, and indeed of generations before and after. And it begs the question, you know, what are or were the expectations of settler colonial society? And what I mean by that is U.S. society, and it's well established and really not controversial to me that the United States is a settler colonial state. And the expectations of settler colonial states is that they will destroy and replace indigenous presence. It's part of the project. In fact, a settler state cannot be fully born and maturated without the elimination of the indigenous presence, right? The presence of indigenous peoples. And in so doing, it's really guided, and I'm drawing here from an anthropologist named Patrick Wolf, whose work I would commend to you as being very important. He talks about settler society being driven by a logic of elimination. And, you know, as we've noted, Thorpe was born in 1887, the very year that the Allotment Act was passed. And I think the author does a nice job of unpacking that. He attends Carlisle, which is a laboratory for assimilation, i.e. cultural elimination. I mean, his life is absolutely an affirmation of the reality of settler colonialism and its intention to destroy and replace indigenous identities. And so the expectation in euphemistic terms, I guess, is that Native people are vanishing, but Native people are being killed. They are being assaulted. They are having violence visited upon them physically, culturally, linguistically, spiritually, many forms of this violence that is sort of understood in this concept of the vanishing Indian. And you're seeing one emblem of that. There are signs and symbols of this expectation everywhere in American culture at the turn of the century, and they're very much with us, and they're contested today in the 21st century. But here we have James Earl Fraser, and I chose this photo because he's literally making the image. He is forming this visual, this physical representation of an expectation. And this is the very famous and very ubiquitous sculpture, The End of the Trail. And so the expectation at the beginning of the 20th century, as Thorpe is entering the world, is that it's not going to last very long, that Native people don't have long as a race of people and must inevitably disappear. And this sort of defeated Indian on a horse at the end of the Trail of Tears, or just the metaphorical end of history and of time, are expected to recede into the past right along with it. And so his presence, his very physical presence, is an unexpected presence. And indeed, it's treated as an anomaly. Hence the whole curriculum at the Carlisle Indian School and others like it. But this notion of vanishingness, of the vanishing Indian, is really built upon a larger way of conceptualizing indigeneity. And the historian Paige Rabemond does a fantastic job of showing us this in what she calls the binaries of authenticity. And I just wanted to share that with you here. And what she really means is, as the text says here, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, settler colonial societies, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, they fashioned powerful either-or notions of indigenous authenticity that rely on a wide variety of binaries. And then she gives you a bunch of examples of that. So to be authentically Indian is to be traditional, pagan, feminine, irrational, uncivilized, as you see here. To be inauthentically Indian would be to be future-oriented, have a sense of individual identity, to be in time historically, to be civilized, etc. or as you continue to become white. So you see it creates a catch-22. So if Native people adapt to this world that's being so radically transformed around them successfully, they're no longer authentic believes it to be. And that represents a profound challenge. And then it creates other examples of the binary as it purportedly exists. In this famous photograph of Geronimo, the great resistance leader in the Southwest at the end of the 19th century, as he is adjusting to his life in Oklahoma. And here we see him in a top hat and in a suit driving an automobile. And with him, of course, on the Southern Plains are these Native people who are dressed up in what appear to be powwow regalia. And at the time that this photograph was taken, this was supposed to be received as sort of an impossibility, as something that would, as Deloria would say, produce a chuckle, because that's not, Geronimo's no longer authentic, and you can't have these things together. This Indianness and whiteness are not meant to coexist with each other. And so what's important about Thorpe's life to me is that he refuses the very notion that this binary exists simply by navigating a life more or less on his own terms. And the point I wanted to make, and I think Kayley did a wonderful job of kind of laying the groundwork for this, is he was never alone. I'm sure he felt alone. But what I mean is that there are Native people in all walks of life at the turn of the century defying these expectations that Native people must inevitably vanish. And I just wanted to quickly share, you can read that text down there if you'd like, some examples. So you have Native people politically mobilizing through the Society of American Indians, which was founded in 1911 in Columbus, Ohio. But there are many other Native political organizations that are fighting for Native rights, articulating indigenous identities that are very much a part of the world being constructed around Native people and so forth. I mean, just the clothing that the founders of the Society of American Indians are wearing are refusing the idea that there's an authentic way of being Indian in terms of their clothes or sartorial choices. Arthur C. Parker, who you're seeing in the top center, is a Seneca who becomes an ethnologist and really uses his command of ethnology, of anthropological knowledge, in order to undermine these kind of pseudoscientific notions of race and racial determinism that are casting Native people as inherently and racially inferior. Zitkala Shah is the next person you're seeing. She's Dakota. She is a writer and a poet and a political activist, but she too used her writing and formal publications in journals read by popular audiences to challenge expectations about civilization. And in fact, one of her most famous essays is called Why I Am a Pagan. And she talks about the Christians that she interacts with and how they don't really model Christ-like behavior. And she says, well, if that's Christianity, then by all means, I'm a pagan. And then in the bottom left, you have kind of in the front row there, Lillian St. Cyr and James Youngdeer. And Lillian St. Cyr and Youngdeer were married, and they wrote, they directed, they produced and acted in, many films at the very birth of the silent film industry and of course of Hollywood. And in so doing, they asserted an indigenous presence in an area that, again, was creating films to write Indian people out of existence. The last two examples here are of Kiowa artists on the plains who are crafting innovative artistic forms. These are not timeless artistic traditions that you're looking at. Jack Hokia on the left, Lois Smokey on the right. And what I really love actually about the one on the right is it's just called Kiowa Family. And of course, Kiowa reportedly at this time. And here she is depicting the ongoing presence of Kiowa family in the midst of it. And of course, Hokia is showing you in an era that was seeing the outlawing and punishment for practicing what you'd call traditional religions, the ongoing practice of those very traditions as legitimate traditions. So Thorpe is a part of this larger generation of indigenous people who are navigating in their own ways the very same challenges that Thorpe was navigating. And the author does a nice job of talking about the Olympics. He speaks a bit about Louis Tewanima, who you see in the bottom left here, being among the participants at that Olympics and one of the medal winners. Duke Kahanamoku, who is a legendary swimmer and surfer, a Kanaka Maoli person who was a multi-Olympian and won, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 medals over the course of his career. And Andrew Sokolexis, as you know, if you've read the book, he was present and favored to win a medal, but didn't. But then, you can look at any sport in the early 20th century and find Native people there. So that includes baseball. And so Louis Sokolexis at Cleveland, the Guardian said they named their team after back in the day. He was an outfielder during his whole career for the Cleveland Spiders. John Myers, a Coahuila from California. He played for more teams than the Giants, but he really kind of made his name as a really great hitting catcher for the New York Giants. And they called him Chief, obviously in a derogatory way, Charles Albert Bender, an Anishinaabe, and someone inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame and played in World Series and was very successful for the better part of his career with the Philadelphia Athletics. So Native people are everywhere in this world being constructed around Indigenous people, and which seeks also to eliminate them. And I just wanted to commend to you, I know it's probably a bunch of readers in this group, Matthew Gilbert's really beautiful book, Hopi Runners. And he talks about Louis Tewanima, but he situates the very meaning of running in a Hopi-centric context. And that's something that I think brings added value to his perspective. And he really wants you to understand what it meant to Tewanima and other Hopis simply to run, right? So it's not just being a great runner, competing in the Olympics, winning a medal. It's an assertion of Hopiness, right? And indigeneity to run in that way. So why this book now? Why does this book matter? Why was it published now? I think you're going to get a lot of different points of view on this. I'd like us to return to the unexpected and add into this presence and renaissance. I think this book is really important, and I think it makes a lot of sense for it to have been published now, because it helps us to see, and I hope you'll read more to learn about these other extraordinary lives, that Jim Thorpe is part of an Indigenous tradition of adopting innovative new means of preserving and protecting and indeed reimagining indigeneity itself, but also Indigenous place, space, and belonging that extends, to the very advent of colonization and continues to the present. And on a related point, I see Jim Thorpe as an author, right? Writing his self into the world through his actions, an author of a long and complex, multifaceted history of Indigenous persistence and of refusing these settler colonial expectations of vanishing, of erasure, that's continuing to be written. And so it reminds us then his life story of ongoing Indigenous presence and indeed Renaissance in our very time. So I'm going to stop right there and thank you all for your time. And I'm anxious for the give and take in the wake of the other presentations.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I want to just say in segueing to our next speaker, there are 2 sites in Pennsylvania that are inextricably bound up with Jim Thorpe's life. Kayley spoke about one, and that is Jim Thorpe, the town named for him posthumously, and also the very controversial site of his tomb and where his bones lie today. But the other one, of course, is Carlisle College, which is where the Carlisle Indian College, which is the school he attended and where he rose to fame as an athlete. And you can't think of Jim Thorpe without his connection to Carlisle College. And that brings me to our next speaker, Sandra Cianciulli, who was born and raised in the Philadelphia area. She's descended from Oglala Sioux tribe located in South Dakota, a lifetime member of the National Congress of American Indians, the NCAI. She served on a White House committee and an American Indian Advisory Committee to the Democratic National Committee, DNC, that proposed the formation of an American Indian caucus. During her tenure at a faith-based nonprofit, Sandra Cianciulli represented her organization at the UN and Organization of American States during the consultation process for both versions of the Indigenous Rights Declarations. She is active in the local Indian organization, the Circle Legacy Center, as well as her church activities with her Native Ministries program. She is immediate past president emeritus of the Carlisle Indian School project. As a descendant of Carlisle Indian School students, she is passionately committed to the mission of the Carlisle Indian School project to build an interpretive center focused on the complicated history of the boarding school era at Carlisle and its impact on contemporary Native communities. And I must say, she's written very movingly about being taken by her father to pay tribute to Thorpe at Carlisle. She may comment on that in a few moments, but I do recommend to you that piece is available on site at the Carlisle Indian School Project website, and it's really worth the read. But thank you so much for participating, Sandy. I turn it over to you now.
It's an honor to be asked to speak with all these good speakers. It's been wonderful listening to people who kind of speak my language. So it's very impressive. I hope I don't disappoint. But yeah, I will talk. I can't talk about Jim Thorpe without talking about my father. Jim Thorpe was his idol. I mean, you think as a young Native person, what role models did you have? And especially when he came east, and he and his cousin hitchhiked because they picked up a newspaper at the railway station because they needed insulation for their house, and they started reading, and it said they were hiring Indians to work the high steel because they weren't afraid of heights. They were both afraid of heights. They were both a whole head and shoulders taller than the Mohawks were there. But they went, and that was the only job they were really considered for. And they got over their fears and worked the steel, but there was nothing. My father's first descriptor would be jock, but I think that the camaraderie, the tribalness was something he missed, and he always reached out for. But he worshipped. I think it's the only book he ever read was Jim Thorpe, and I found it when he died, and it was in tatters. And when Jim Thorpe died in 1953, I remember him going to Oklahoma. When he found out that he was going to be buried in Pennsylvania, where he lived, and he lived in Pennsylvania because he was one of 17. He didn't want to be near his family. My mother's family was from Baltimore, and he found out he didn't want to be near her, too close to her family either. So they settled in Philadelphia. And Kayley, I must tell you that my birthday is May 24th. Jim Thorpe's birthday is considered either the 26th or the 28th, and nobody has ever said for sure. But my father would say, for your birthday, why don't we go to Jim Thorpe? Where he would take at least a half an hour to do. He did come specifically there for that. But you forgot to talk about the beach. To me, Jim Thorpe was the beach. My mother, we'd lose her on the antiquing part, but we would spend the day at the beach. I forget what lake it is. It's been a long time since I've been to the beach, but we would go to the grave and then we would go to the beach. But since I started working at Carlisle, where my father also took me when I was a kid, we liked to go on. I adored my father, and we liked to go on little road trips. And at that time, it took about 3 hours to get to Carlisle and 3 hours to get to Jim Thorpe. But it was wonderful. And I have so many fond memories of all of those trips. Like I said, my father was a jock. His logic didn't always make sense, but it was pure, and it was he always made me feel cherished all his life. So I have fond memories of Jim Thorpe, and he was important to us then. When I started working with the Carlisle Indian School project, I realized one thing. My mother was German, my father was Indian. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to history growing up because neither side was very good news. And I decided one of my father's cousins came to live with us, and she was very involved with the National Congress of American Indians. And I decided that that was a way to be part of the solution. And I volunteered for NCAI when I was like 14, 15 years old, filling water glasses and sharpening pencils. I was in my 30s and people were still walking up to me asking me if I could make copies for them. So it was home, and as a mixed blood, it was something I could do long distance too. I lived in Pennsylvania and I didn't want to live in South Dakota. So, but when we started working on Carlisle, I realized this was our greatest generation. It was the grit, just by sheer grit, that some people stood out. And of course, Jim Thorpe was one of them. And when I was reading David's book, I have never been impressed by non-Indian, born and raised in Philadelphia area. I didn't learn anything about Indians in school. I learned it from my family. So I was never surprised. I never had great expectations from anyone who was non-Indian. I didn't have any kind of different background. Other people from different countries, immigrants, had more understanding than people born and raised here. So I knew that this, when I read David's book, I was highly impressed. And first of all, he's a very good writer to keep my attention. For 30 years, I read nothing but legislation. So it's hard to just read, and he kept my attention. And I was always surprised and happily so of how deep he went into it. It wasn't a jock writing about a jock. And I don't mean to put jocks down. I love jocks. I was raised by one. But this was very thoughtful and insightful. In fact, Kayley, we need to talk, because I would be proud to be able to hand one of David's books to donors and say thank you. This is our thank you. And so if you can part with a box or two that we could use, that would be wonderful. But as I was reading it, it took me back to my own thoughts about this greatest generation, that in some ways, there were groups of people that joined together for the first Pan-American Indian concept of an organization. And they held on for dear life to their culture, so that today there is a culture. And if it wasn't for them, I don't know if it would be here. What we did with one of the first things we did when we formed the organization, the Carlisle Indian School project, was get involved at the barracks. There's a 50, if everybody doesn't know, it's a war college, an active war college. And every year for the past, going on 50 years, they've had Jim Thorpe Sports Days. And it's when the war colleges from around the Northeast get together and they compete with each other. And the average age of the trainers is about 40, so it's not too, they don't take it too seriously. It's a lot of fun, and I was invited, and we went to and watched it, and I thought, oh my goodness, our veterans would absolutely love to come to something like this. But I was a little shocked. I mean, they have this torch there. They have relay race to open up everything, and they talked about Jim Thorpe, and it was just all this testosterone, you know, and geez, that was some of the women, but it was just a wonderful thing to see everybody come together like that. So we, Circle Legacy Centers started sponsoring a Native veteran or public servant. We had Deb Holland there at one of the events. And we said we needed an Indian person to start it out. There were actually people born and raised there in Carlisle who did not know that Jim Thorpe was Native. They always wondered why he had been in Carlisle. There were people in Carlisle who didn't know there was an Indian school there. The only language that I found in the tourism literature was Carlisle Indian School Cemetery, 186 student graves, period. That was it. And we've been training ourselves to give tours. We do the Indian part. We went on a couple of tours with some of the docents from the Army Heritage and Education Center. And we just said, you know, we'll do the Indian part. You do the military part. We won't do the military part if you don't do the Indian part. Because they made it sound like it was a resort, that the students couldn't wait to go there. And so all of this ignorance over someone who accomplished, but it took Jim Thorpe. He's the only reason people know the name Carlisle. They may not know why he was there, but they knew he was there. I can assure you that every Indian in this country that has a drop of Indian blood knows about Carlisle. And it seems to be that David is bringing about by, first of all, making our most famous. By the way, my father was Oglala, one town away from where Billy Mills grew up. And I never forget my father standing in front of the television when Billy won in the Olympics, when he won the 10K race. And he was just standing there, making no noise, but just had tears rolling down his face. And then one of my cousins, this is the other thing people don't, Indians like to laugh. Mrs. Hermione Horses lived in the same town with the Millses. And when she was told Billy won the gold medal in the Olympics in 1964, she said, Billy Mills won? Well, that boy stole one of my pies, and I had to catch him and grab him by the scruff of the neck. So that was their reaction to it. Of course, he has done so much for he's got a community center named after him, and also Jim Thorpe is extremely precious to him too. He knows he's in his shadow, but there's been excellence in every, and my German grandmother, was not your typical. She was a delightful person, and she found beauty in every culture. And in the 50s, she had a lady that was a Black lady that cleaned her house for her, because she owned catering business. And she said she kept her house so nice, she wanted to come and visit her. That didn't happen in Baltimore in the 50s, but she went and visited her and went in the front door. So I think David is on the cusp of a sort of generational renaissance that I think we try every once in a while. And I'm not a philosopher, but I noticed that there are more and more Native authors. And there's more and more non-Native authors who are taking an interest. I never knew any. Ziolkowski is one of my heroines, and I never knew anybody that knew who she was in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is giving grants to learning about the Conestoga Massacre. I didn't learn that till I was in my 60s. And there is this land acknowledgement thing where people acknowledged where their institution is built on the tribes that were there, and giving it, just acknowledging that they're there. So I think there's an awakening going on, and I'm glad this book is going to be part of it, because I think it gives a complete picture, a very thorough picture of a hero of ours, of a Native hero, but an American hero. And he had some obstacles for sure, but he survived, and his memory shall go on. And the shirt I have behind me is my grandson's shirt. So a new generation is learning about a great person who happens to be Indian. And when he went in the movies, he not only was one of the founders and first president of what became the National Football League, but he also with Luther Standing Bear, formed an actors organization. Everything in those days was association. So it was Indian Actors Association, I believe. And it was to watch out, look out for Native people, that they get paid properly, and how they were portrayed in Native pictures. So I think that David picked a wonderful hero. I'm very grateful that he did. And coming from a non-Native person makes it, I'm sorry to say, makes it more impactful. So that's all I have to say. I don't know if I did my time. I tried to watch, but I think we're good. I'm good. Thank you very much for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you so much. That was really marvelous. Our last speaker is Robert Thurston, who's Professor Emeritus of History at Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, where he taught for several decades. He's a prolific scholar, and he's kind of a quintessential historian. I mean, he lives and breathes history, and he's, as a prolific author, he's lived several different lives as a historian. So first of all, I mean, his primary specialization, he's published a lot in modern Russian and Soviet history. Books like Liberal City, Conservative State, Moscow and Russia's Urban Crisis, 1906 to 1914. He's written on life and terror in Stalin's Russia. And he's also written on witch hunts in Europe and North America as well. But another area in which Bob Thurston has written is in coffee, the history of coffee production. He's also a coffee roaster himself, but he's visited coffee farms on 4 different continents and has given numerous talks on coffee, including coffee and health. And this has resulted in 2 very substantial books, Coffee from Bean to Barista, which came out in 2018, and Coffee, a comprehensive guide to the bean, the beverage, and the industry, which was chosen for all sorts of awards, by the way. It's a very respected text. But a third area in which Bob Thurston has published, and published quite a bit, is modern US social and cultural history. One book, Lynching, American Mob Murder in a Global Perspective, appeared in 2011. But also, and this brings us, really connects with this panel, more recently, in actually just this year, The Body in the Anglosphere, 1880 to 1920. And I was familiar with that book as he was writing it, and knew that part of it, he looks at the violence of early football. And this was the period when Jim Thorpe was playing, of course, and he examines the development of the sport in that light. There's all kinds of other areas of American culture that he looks at, circuses and other places where the question of the body arises. But it's that connection that led me to ask Robert Thurston to speak. Currently, he's doing research for a book on the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, which actually has some interesting connections with Easton, actually, because it ties back to Sullivan and his march out of Easton on the so-called Sullivan Trail, and maybe he'll touch on that. But in any case, I want to turn the floor over to Robert Thurston and invite you to speak.
Yeah, thanks very much, Eric. And thanks for reminding me about what I'm supposed to talk about today, because sometimes I sort of slip into other modes like coffee without even thinking about it. So, but I want to mention that a couple of things. One, Miami University is named after the Miami people. And in this vicinity, southwestern Ohio, there is the Great Miami River and the Little Miami River. And then there used to be talk in the 18th century about the three Miamis. And the third one is now called the Maumee River. It feeds into Lake Erie in northern Ohio. And I mention that partly because the other half, in a way, of what I'm working on now is the Battle of Fallen Timbers, also in 1794. That was the first time that the U.S. Army defeated the old Northwest Indian Alliance of Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandotte, and so on. Before that, that group had inflicted two terrible defeats on American expeditions. So I want to talk about the historical background of Indians in that area a little bit, because it ties into what happened to Jim Thorpe in a big way, and then about football. And I hope I'll have time to show you a few pictures. First of all, I think there's no word more important in David Maraniss's book than civilization. Of course, there's the line about kill the Indian and save the man, but the idea there is to save a civilized man. And the supervisors of the Carlisle School talked about civilizing the Indians all the time. Now that word is interesting in and of itself. The way in which we use the word civilization only dates from the middle of the 18th century. It was invented by philosophers of the Enlightenment, especially in France. And it was a proud boast at that point of Western Europeans. They wanted to distinguish themselves from barbarian or infant nations to the east, Poland and Russia, for example. So by civilization at that point, the philosophers meant the rule of law, secular above religious values, certain kinds of music and art, and decent treatment of women. Hold on, I just mean they just meant decent treatment relative to what they saw in Turkey and Persia, or thought they saw there. So women were not supposed to be beaten and so on. And of course, that was just the theory of it all. Anyway, with that idea in mind, in the American colonies, a school was established to try to civilize Indians. as early as 1754. It was called Moore's Indian Charity School in Connecticut. From 1754 into the early 1770s, educated a number of Native American boys and girls, especially boys. That school moved to New Hampshire and eventually became Dartmouth College, which Eric would know about, but that's another story. Anyway, so already there was the attempt to make Indian young people into civilized folks who might, at least in theory, coexist with whites. The Shawnee chief Blue Jacket sent his sons to white schools to be educated. And George Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, talked about bringing civilization to the Indians. Knox in 1792 wrote to the sachems and warriors of the tribes inhabiting the Miami River, now called the Maumee River in northern Ohio. He wrote, "We do not want to drive you from your lands." Actually, they did. He said, rather, quote, "We should be greatly gratified with the opportunity of imparting to you all the blessings of civilized life, of teaching you to cultivate the earth and raise corn." I'm not sure how, and Washington had the same kind of idea. I'm not sure how sincere they were, because they were also preparing war against the Indians at exactly the same time. But they wanted to try to, I don't know, do things right and legally and all that. And it's ironic because at that point, Indians were raising corn. They didn't deal much with livestock, but the Miami people and the Iroquois were quite good farmers, especially for that day and age. Anyway, the Indians already had a negative image, not only because of warfare, but for other reasons. They operated by consensus. Yes, they had chiefs, but the chiefs had no coercive power whatsoever. They had to get everybody to agree with them to do anything at all. But there were, on the other hand, war chiefs. And when any nation was preparing for war or infighting, those chiefs could give orders. Otherwise, on a day-to-day basis, no, absolutely everything was run by consensus. There was no class structure among Native Americans. And this baffled Europeans because they thought, again, that their civilization depended on a rigid class structure, a hierarchy. Those at the top would give the orders, those down below would follow the orders. So it really bothered them that the Indians didn't have that kind of social and authoritative structure. There was too much movement in whites' eyes by Indians looking for game animals. They just weren't settling down. They weren't doing enough farming for whites, as Henry Knox suggested, although there was some good farming going on. The role of women among American Indians was something that was really suspicious to Euro-Americans. Indian women often were keepers of the land, among the Iroquois especially. They bequeathed property and so on. It went down the matrilineal line, not the patriarchal line. Indian women often spoke in councils and so on. And they were, by the way, the peacemakers in wars between Indian nations. So this was also really suspicious. And it served to, in whites' eyes, feminize Indian males. At one of this, there's a really bifurcated vision because the Indian males were regarded as good warriors. They were sometimes called the best light infantry in the world by American officers. But at the same time, Indian males didn't do all the things that white males were supposed to do. And this was somehow also upsetting the natural God-given order of things. So, but at the same time, we have to say that the American Indians did practice torture extensively of captives and burning them alive. And it's not that there were no atrocities on the American or British sides, there are plenty of those, but the torturing and burning continued among Native American peoples at a time, the 18th century, when finally those practices went out of fashion and out of legal procedures. There was plenty of mishandling of prisoners and so on, But this was also supposed to be a great sign of civilization in Europe. We don't torture prisoners anymore. That at least was the theory. And the technological gap, of course, when Euro-Americans first encountered Native Americans, the natives were using stone tools and so on, didn't have ships, didn't have firearms. So that was a source of condescension on the side of the whites toward Native Americans. Although I have to say there were plenty of positive images circulating at the same time out of captive narratives where especially, well, women and men whites who had been captured by Indians often had a lot of praise for the peoples that they lived with and often wanted to go back even after they had been returned to white society. And there were other positive statements about Indians, the way they shared things, the way they cared for old people and children in missionary accounts and in literature, although that becomes a very tangled story, James Fenimore Cooper and so on. And of course, a lot of respect, again, for Indians' fighting abilities. All right, jump ahead to football. Also, as Eric said, something I've been interested in lately. Football, as it developed in this country, the first real game was 1869, but the really big growth of football and its notoriety was in the 1880s. That process also involved basic questions of civilization, but in effect the other way around. By the middle of the 19th century, Anglo-Saxon males in particular began to be anxious about their manhood, and we could talk about that maybe. But the words manly and manliness became huge in the vocabulary of the day. And Anglo-Saxon males began to worry quite a bit that they were suffering from too much civilization. They were repressed and they weren't in touch with instinct and feeling very much. You can see this very clearly in literature. The best example, I think, is Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case, not the strange case, but strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Jekyll is a perfectly respectable doctor in London. He has no contact with women. He mixes up a powder and changes into Hyde, and Hyde feels things intensely. He's also evil, but so I'll leave that apart. And eventually Jekyll kills himself to get rid of Hyde. So it doesn't work very well. But you can see the same sort of striving for feeling and romance on the part of whites in books like novels like Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines, 1885. Tarzan is a great example. Edgar Rice Burroughs published the first Tarzan stories in 1912, 1913. And in those stories, the hero is often presented as part animal or having animal characteristics. So the character has this great internal strength and power, but how to get to it is the trick. Tarzan is described by Burroughs as leaping to the ground, sinuous and cat-like. And this is done over and over again. The Virginian, the great cowboy novel, same type of thing. So we have a new fascination with the body by that time, and it ties into this question of instinct versus repression, naturalness is a great 19th century word, natural versus civilized, overly civilized. And so, and there's tremendous attention and devoted to the female body as well. And this is the great era of the development of photography. Photography grows up. So all of a sudden you have photographs of the body and the circus, by the way, putting the body on display around the world in a way that had never, ever been possible before, never been done before. Women picked up sports too, incidentally, and some fairly rough stuff, basketball and field hockey, where they clobbered each other with their sticks and so on. And football is all tied up with this kind of dilemma, civilized versus instinctual. Walter Camp, who was the great Yale coach, for a long time, wrote in 1896 about the qualities of college men playing the game. He said, football provided a systematic outlet for the animal spirits in young men. So there you have it. President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903 said, I believe in rough games and in rough, manly sports. I do not feel any particular sympathy for the person who gets battered about a good deal, so long as it is not fatal. Thank you, Theodore Roosevelt. So there was, by the way, tremendous criticism of football in that era as too bloody, a lot of broken bones, a lot of deaths. Dan said that? Anyway, so back and forth, which we still have today. Is football a decent sport? Should we support it? And there's so many brain injuries on the other hand. Anyway, it was really, really big at that time. There's a comment by a historian that on college campuses across the country, that school spirit reached hysterical proportions each autumn. And there were mass protests by students whenever a college administration tried to outlaw football. It's a little bit difficult, but you can still understand that today. So the story of the Carlisle School fits into the long history of efforts to civilize the Indians, at least from the middle of the 18th century on. We can almost say that there's no more important word in Path Lit by Lightning than civilization again. And Thorpe fit beautifully into the new worship of the body and of manliness. And it was okay, even extra entertaining in a way, that he was an Indian. Better Jim Thorpe than Jack Johnson, the black heavyweight champion. Although Johnson won the heavyweight boxing title in 1908 and defended it in Reno, Nevada in 1910. But I have to say, even he was tolerated or honored, not in the Deep South, until he got into a terrible personal scandal several years later. Anyway, Jim Thorpe was light-skinned enough to fit, if awkwardly, into the world of the white people. He could be the best savage, yet he could.
We're breaking up again.
You want me to get
I'm
out?
so
and get
sorry.
back? I can get out.
Yeah, turn off your video and
What? Stop the video? All right, stop the video.
yeah, try. Now try to speak.
I'll try to speak. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me? Raise your hands. Some of you can hear me. Oh, man. Okay, cool. All right. So anyway, so Thorpe was light-skinned enough to fit, if awkwardly, into the white person's world. He could be the best savage yet. He could, this is the unexpected part, I think, above all, he could speak well, he could dance beautifully, he could ice skate, he could wear a suit, all of that. He did fit in that ways. And maybe most important, all of the Indians in the United States had been defeated before Jim Thorpe really came on the scene. So they could be in some ways put off into the past, and everybody could be nostalgic about them, and they could appear in Buffalo Bill's Wild West programs and so on, and all be quite safe at that point. Jim Thorpe's story was all ultimately very sad, although he was successful in so many ways, but also very, very American. I wonder if I have enough time to share a screen and just a few pictures. Would that work, Eric? Eric?
Yes, that works.
Okay. Okay. Except it doesn't work. Okay. In many ways, back in the 18th century or even earlier, there was what was called the middle ground. There's a famous book by that title. And here you see Chief Joseph Brant of the Iroquois, and he's obviously dressed in native gear, we might say, but also has a European coat on. And Indians, some were very much admired for their looks, by the way, at that time. And we do have things like reenactors now in what are taken to be authentic costumes. This was at Fallen Timbers a couple of years ago. This is the Lenape tribal member. And you can see he's got the musket and other things that might be considered from the white world. And he's put them together, I think, in a way that was popular at that point. To jump ahead again, the body became extremely important for people like Buffalo Bill. Oh, okay. And a huge impact in regard to the body started in this country when the German bodybuilder Eugen Sandow began to appear in New York and Chicago. This was a real shock, and he did appear this way with a fig leaf on stage, and it really kicked off an exercise craze and much more attention to the body. But although football and so on was already becoming very popular, women also got into the exercise craze, and every big circus after a while had a female star, usually an acrobat or equestrian. I think maybe it's bogus that she could lift an elephant off the ground, but she was certainly very, very strong. Let's go back for a second. And women played to the camera in a big way. Here is the first great American female sex symbol, Evelyn Nesbit, at the age of about 16 in 1900. And then you can see over here, Women's Physical Development, one of a number of magazines that really promoted exercise for women. And so again, Thorpe fits into this. At the same time, you have thoroughly negative images of Indians still, the captive 1891. And here the woman is absolutely virginal and white and super pale and blonde. And the Indian just thinking about what he's going to do to her, but the rest is left to your imagination. Jack Johnson, 1910, the boxers did well before that strip down to trunks and boots, and so their bodies were almost perfectly on display. And let me go back. I don't know why my computer's doing this. This is Outing Magazine, November, I guess it's 1894 actually. And I love the expressions on this guy's face, their face. They're out for mayhem. They're out to crash into other people. And in that way, again, to demonstrate their manliness. And then finally, one of the weirdest things of all, this was the Order of the Red Men, 1834, established for white men. But it became very, very popular by the late 19th century. And I'm not going to read this whole thing for you. The woman is absolutely white, Anglo-Saxon, and you can tell by her hairstyle and hat that this is pre-World War I. So I'll read part of this. This is supposedly her talking. I always liked a red man with his war whoop loud and shrill, ready to come to an Injun's help whenever that Injun will. And I love his courage, and I, his fair young squaw beside, and his courage through ordeal. I certainly do like a red man, for a red man's true as steel. So she didn't really want an actual Indian. She just wanted the idea that she would find some white guy who had this great inner strength and instinct and was natural and not super repressed by civilization. So once again, it strikes me that all this is a great story. I don't think I have much of anything to add to what's been said about why the book was published now, except that American literature and film and so on. And I want to add, though, the depiction of American Indians in film has been extremely complicated and convoluted. In the year 1950, there was one movie, Rio Grande, that depicts Apaches as terrorists and child molesters and so on. And in that same year, 1950 was the film Broken Arrow, which is almost totally sympathetic to the Apaches. So back and forth, back and forth. But I think the book does a great job of bringing out Jim Thorpe's story and setting it into the social, cultural, and political context of the time. So that's.
I want to thank all four of the panelists, and we do have a little time now if you do have any questions.
And there was a split, a division between his children. The sons unanimously wanted him back in Oklahoma. The daughters eventually kind of accepted what the stepmother had done, the third wife. But now I think it's fair to say, my reading of the book, it's fair to say that the family as a whole now is united in liking him back in Oklahoma. I know, Dan, do you have anything to say about that with respect to the way that Sac and Fox people would properly bury their dead?
I don't want to try to speak to Sac and Fox mortuary practice. What I can say, I think that's probably helpful here, is that different tribal communities have different attitudes toward the remains of their ancestors. Some communities approach them as things that have been so desecrated they can't be returned. Others approach them as things that must be returned and be reburied. And it really varies from community to community. And I don't know what the Sac and Fox intention is after the repatriation of Jim Thorpe's remains. I don't know if, they intend to completely inter his body and just do away with the whole kind of memorial around it, to simply lay him to rest or not. But I think the really important thing I wanted to convey is that it does not take a court case to do the right thing. That just because the courts have made a decision that NAGPRA does not apply to this, and this gives us, this is a window into the ongoing injustice of the treatment of Native people today. So NAGPRA only applies to institutions that receive federal money. And I know the angle that the litigants took on this, but if human remains, indigenous human remains, funerary objects, any of those things are found on private land, Native people have no legal mechanism to ensure that those are returned. And that doesn't mean that they can't be, though, so that the town could do the right thing and just simply choose to act in a way that is consistent with the desires of Jim Thorpe's family tomorrow, if they wanted to. And I guess I would like, personally, I know you didn't ask my opinion, but I would like to see that happen. I think if a family tells you that they would like the remains of their ancestor back because it is doing them harm to be separated from them, and it would make them more whole by having those remains returned, the right thing to do is to return them. And again, it does not take a court battle and years and years and years of people digging in, fighting this out. And let me just say one final thing is that one of the really terrible things about what happened is it really represents a kind of taking of possession of another person's life. And I know the history of how it happened is fraught, but Jim Thorpe doesn't belong to that town, and there's nothing that's going to change that. And so I think that the right way out of this is for that community to do the right thing vis-a-vis Jim Thorpe's family. But what the Sac and Fox and the family choose to do, that's going to be their decision to make in the wake of it.
Thank you very much. Just, I'm sorry that at this point we are going to have to stop, and there's a lot more to discuss about this book. But again, I want to thank everyone for coming here, and also especially the four panelists and the Easton Book Festival for sponsoring this panel. We had some technical difficulties, but I think we got through them, and we'll close now. But thank you again, everyone. Take care.
Yeah.